man or woman, have done their bit. Everyone has tried, none has been. Neither the long years, nor the dangers, nor the fierce attacks of the enemy have in any way weakened the unbending resolve of the British nation. God bless you all.
Monday morning in central London on May the 7th, 1945 was overcast but dry. But unlike previous Mondays over the last 5 years, there seemed to be more people around. Amongst the crowds beginning to gather in Piccadilly Circus and Trafalgar Square, thoughts of the dull spring weather were set aside. News was coming through of momentous events in Europe. Ever since the US and Russian forces had met at Torgau on the River Elbe on April the 25th, it seemed the end of the war against Nazi Germany was in sight. Over the last weeks of April, the newsreels were full of stories documenting the collapse of the Third Reich. All German forces in Italy had surrendered. The Red Army was fighting its way through Berlin, street by street. As the last defences crumbled, Hitler committed suicide just before the Red Army soldiers finally smashed their way through to raise the Soviet flag over the Reichstag, the German Parliament building. To the north, British forces had crossed the River Elbe as well and had gone on to capture Hamburg, Germany's second city. But on Monday, May the 7th, people up and down Britain sensed that something momentous was about to happen. After 6 years of sacrifice, during which they had been bombed, machine-gunned and starved, the British public knew that the war must be over.
The events in Europe at the beginning of May 1945 start to move really quickly. On the 1st, it's announced to the world that Hitler is dead. 2 days later, his successor, Grand Admiral Dönitz, sends a delegation to Montgomery's headquarters on Lüneburg Heath near Hamburg. Montgomery finds their terms unacceptable and sends them away. They return the following day, and that afternoon the surrender is signed in Montgomery's tent. The end of the war in Europe is drawing nearer.
The German command to carry out at once, and without argument or comment, all further orders that will be issued by the Allied powers on any subject. Disobedience of orders or failure to comply with them will be regarded as a breach of these surrender terms and will be dealt with by the Allied powers in accordance with the accepted laws and usages of war.
All across Germany, the Reich, which was meant to last 1,000 years, began to crumble. German forces were laying down their weapons, sometimes individually, other times as whole divisions. They joined the thousands of refugees already on the congested roads across Germany, as everyone sought to flee to the west, away from the Soviet army. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe, realized that now was the moment to press home the advantage.
Eisenhower, concerned that the Germans were trying to drive a wedge between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, decreed that there would no longer be any more of these partial surrenders. The only thing acceptable to him was a complete, unconditional surrender of all German forces.
Over the weekend, the German delegation arrived at the Allied headquarters in Rheims in northern France. Realizing that there was little that they had left to negotiate with, they signed the instrument of surrender. As news of the signing of the instrument of surrender in Rheims spread, tens of thousands of Londoners and people from around the country poured into central London. In Piccadilly Circus, civilians, servicemen and women filled the pavements and roads. Cars and buses struggled to find a way through the happy crowds. A column of students marched up and down the Strand before heading off down Pall Mall towards Buckingham Palace. But there had been no official announcement that the war in Europe was really over.
The Allied force, which invaded Europe on June 6, 1944, has, with its great Russian allies and forces advancing from the south, utterly defeated the Germans by land, sea, and air. This unconditional surrender has been achieved by teamwork. Teamwork not only among all the allies participating, but among all the services, land, sea, and air.
Eisenhower's words, however, proved premature. No sooner had the news of the surrender reached Moscow than Stalin declared it void. The reality was, he wanted that document to be signed in the heart of the enemy territory, Berlin.
The ink on the surrender documents was barely dry, and already cracks were beginning to appear in the Allies' relationships. A new world order was emerging.
Despite the question marks over the surrender, back in the United Kingdom, everyone was waiting for the official announcement to be made. That came at 3 p.m. on the 8th of May. Britain's biggest party was about to begin.
An enormous crowd now filled London. Some estimates put the figure at around 1 million people. Despite the size of the crowd, they waited patiently for Prime Minister Winston Churchill to address the nation. At 3 p.m, his voice filled the air once more.
Yesterday morning at 2:41 a.m. at General Eisenhower's headquarters, General Jodl, the representative of the German High Command, and of Grand Admiral Dönitz, the designated head of the German state, signed the act of unconditional surrender of all German land, sea, and air forces in Europe to the Allied expeditionary forces and simultaneously to the Soviet High Command. Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday, the 8th of May. The German war is therefore at an end. We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing. Today is Victory in Europe Day. Advance, Britannia! Long live the cause of freedom. God save the King.
Now it was official. Although many people had already started celebrating, the parties could start in earnest. As the celebrations began, Churchill delivered his speech again to Parliament, before leading the great and the good to a short service of thanksgiving in Westminster Abbey.
we decided we would go up to London, and we bought ourselves what was called a workman's ticket in those days for 1 and 6pence, and that was to bring us back home at night. And then we had to sort of waste the day away a bit because all the celebrations were going to be mainly in the evening. So we went up by public transport. We went to Gravesend on the bus, and we went from Gravesend to Dartford and so on. Ended up on the embankment on a tram, and then I enjoyed the evening, and Trafalgar Square, it's unbelievable. It was a wonderful day.
I had a brother who was in the tank regiment and was on holiday, on leave I should say at that time, and having had a motorbike, he took me up to Hammersmith Broadway where all the festivities were taking place. It was an absolutely joyous, carefree, uninhibited display of emotion and relief.
All over the country, towns and villages celebrated with hastily improvised street parties and parades.
I was here in Sevenoaks, and like all children, I took part in the parades, the fancy dress on the Vine cricket ground. We had quite a celebration. What I recall vividly is 2 Spitfires appearing and doing a victory roll over the ground, and we all cheered, and off they went again, presumably to Biggin Hill. That was very exciting. It was almost as if they did it for us kids.
Thousands of cheering people crammed themselves in front of Buckingham Palace. 7 times King George VI, his wife and their 2 daughters, the Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret, stepped out onto the balcony to acknowledge their cheers. The royal princesses were even given permission to go out in disguise and join the celebrating crowds. Soldiers, sailors and airmen were everywhere. But one sharp-eyed cameraman even spotted Hollywood actor David Niven amongst the crowds in London's West End.
Amazing really, it wasn't until then really that I sort of appreciated what the local population really thought about it all, because they couldn't do enough for you. If you're in uniform, you know, if you went into a pub, it never cost you a penny. Drinks were coming up, you know, right, left and centre. And if you walked along a street and there was a street party going on, then you were invited. You know, it was great, really.
For a few hours, people forgot about the trauma of the last 6 years. Social constraints were cast aside as everyone danced and sang. Pubs were given permission to stay open longer, and the dance halls stayed open until midnight.
It may be surprising to know that beer wasn't actually rationed, although availability was often restricted. Despite everything that was going on the other side of the Channel, on the morning of the 8th of May, Winston Churchill still found the time to ensure that there was enough beer available to fuel the party.
With regard to drinking, I was 17 at the time, but I had become a beer drinker. But it was extraordinary in the fact that beer seemed to be in free supply, but if you didn't have a glass, you couldn't get a drink, probably because of the breakages that occurred during the war. So once you'd had a drink, you kept hold of your glass to get the next one. So But the pubs, of course, were crowded. You could hardly get to the bar with people, both before the war ended and afterwards.
News of the surrender spread like wildfire all across Europe. In Paris, crowds gathered in thanksgiving at the Arc de Triomphe. An armada of small boats greeted King Olaf, returning from exile to Norway. Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands also returned home, where many of her subjects had endured a terrible famine in the last months of the war. And Brussels too was the scene of wild celebrations, as the last symbols of Nazi occupation were cast aside.
Well, I was on the airfield in Brussels, which is now the airport, and most people had already gone down to the headquarters for various reasons. And I got a telephone call saying, you better come to group headquarters. So I rang up MT and said, I need a vehicle. And they said, we haven't got one. They're all out. And then they came back to me a few minutes later and said, well, we've got a 1,500 weight truck. So I said, all right, I'll have that. So I took this little truck and drove through Brussels to the headquarters, which was in the old cavalry barracks. And the first time I stopped at a crossroads or lights or whatever, the back filled up with Belgians. And every time I stopped, some got out, more got in. And all cheering and jumping up and down and waving handkerchiefs and having a marvellous time. And then when I eventually pulled into the headquarters, they all got out and said, thank you very much. Quite remarkable, really. Then I went in and did whatever I had to do and walked into the mess, and there was a little bit of a party going on.
In Britain, the 8th and 9th of May were declared public holidays, but the celebrations were to continue for weeks as thousands of soldiers, sailors and airmen returned to their families.
Well, the end of the war was a great relief to me and my father, because we'd spent the war in England, in London, whereas my brothers and brother-in-laws were all in the forces. So it was a great relief to see that they'd all come home, with the exception of my eldest brother, who had died on the HMS Eagle in the Java Seas.
The most cheering sound was the parades through the town. They seemed to happen every Sunday, you know, every so often there was another parade. And on one occasion I was a cub scout, and I was pretty small. And they invited me to lead the parade to the church because the people who follow wanted to take my steps. And there I was put in the front, and behind me there were two policemen, and behind the policemen there was the bands, the Boys Brigade band, and then the army bands, the ATC band, and then there were the Home Guard, and then all this strung all the way down the high street, and then was I right in the front leading it. And my parents were so proud.
Even though there was so much work still to be done, General Eisenhower was ordered back to the United States to take part in celebrations, including a ticker tape parade through New York on June the 29th. But there were many for whom the road back home had been especially long and arduous. As the Allied forces advanced into Germany, they liberated tens of thousands of prisoners of war. Some were out in the open, as many of the camps had been emptied by their guards. Aimlessly, they were marched around the countryside with little or no idea what their fate might be.
We knew it was coming to an end. It was a matter then, really, of what the Germans were going to do. And there was rumours would go around the Germans were going to shoot all prisoners of war, and they were going to move us all up into Schleswig-Holstein, where they would use us as bartering counters and so on. All this sort of thing. But this was rumours.
We were a long line of Kriegies, that's what we called ourselves, all muffled up in whatever we could carry, and German guards on each side of us with bayonets and guns. German officer at the front leading the way. He knew where he was going, nobody else did. And we just struggled along as best we could. Sometimes we did 20 kilometres in a day, sometimes only 10. Sometimes we'd have a day where we'd have to stop because there were so many people falling out with bad feet and blisters and bad legs and so on. They just couldn't go any further, so we had to stop. But mostly they kept us on the move. And we had some very long marches. And we just collapsed at the end of it and tried to make some food and get some sleep. We slept in pigsties and rat-infested places and barns and all sorts of queer places. Slept in the open air a couple of times.
We were in the field, living in the field, an old farmer's field really, and the Germans one night started disappearing, and we could hear the guns, the British Second Army coming along, and by dawn the camp was empty of Germans. We looked around and by 10 o'clock I would say that morning, a tank had rolled up, a British tank, and we said, oh, for God's sake, roll some more tanks up. No, the boys are having tea down there, they can't, they're in no hurry.
With so many men out in the open, the danger of a tragic accident was never far away.
Just after having been issued with Red Cross parcels, we were attacked by a squadron of RAF Typhoons. One can't apportion any blame to them. They saw this column moving alongside wood, and I would never express any blame as far as they were concerned. But there were 39 people killed, 50 odd were injured, some of whom died afterwards. And it was a shocking experience.
We lost quite a number in one attack. Guys, I guess the pilots saw a long marching column and they were all in khaki uniform or in uniform of some kind, and thought, well, we'll have a go at these guys, and they did. They got the end of our march, the long line, a lot of people at the end. I think there was about 17 killed, but I'm not sure of that number, and some wounded. But we felt a bit sad because a lot of them had been 4 years in the prison camp and looked like they were going to survive and get out, and then to have this happen.
An armoured car, I suppose it was, sort of came out of the 5th and 4th Regiment, the British Army, came up. Now, we had already been out down the road and put notices up saying, British prisoners of war, 500 yards ahead, rather like you see on the motorways. So, and these guys, of course, we absolutely climbed all over this. They said, by God, it's a damn good job you left those notices up out there, otherwise we'd have had to have opened fire. So anyway, it was great. So that was the end of hostilities as far as we were concerned. The Germans gave themselves up very happily.
As the prisoners were rounded up, they were brought back to Britain as quickly as possible. The RAF's mighty Avro Lancaster bombers were sent to bring the prisoners home. Some arrived back on VE Day itself.
At the same time as all the parties are beginning in Britain, In the background is Operation Exodus. Launched on the 3rd of April, the plan is to fly back to Britain all those POWs released from camps in Europe. By the time Exodus finished at the end of May, 345,000 ex-prisoners of war had been repatriated by Allied aircraft.
We got back on VE Day, and we were just bundled in, I think 20 in an old Lank, but we couldn't care less. And we were coming across the channel, the pilot said, "Hey, you guys, look, I'm going to dip the old aircraft, we're going to fly along the White Cliffs of Dover." So we did, and we landed.
The RAF were coming over to fly prisoners of war and back, and people going on leave, and we got priority, which we thought was our due.
But when we landed, we were given new uniforms, Tommy's uniforms, and deloused and all that kind of thing. And I was sent down to Lee and Solent from around Guildford to our air base there. And I guess our CO, I was with our CO, and these people, they'd all gone home, of course, as soon as they could. And I, being a Canadian, was left there. And I went in thinking I was well dressed in a new Tommy's uniform into the mess. And with their wing colors, and I went up to the bar, and I thought the old commander was going to have a heart attack. He was just red in the face, and he said, "You get out of here." So I thought, well, the hell with him. So I got out. I didn't feel very comfortable there anyway, so I missed my drink there. And the steward came out from behind the bar and said, "I'll lend you a white shirt and collar and tie." And so I said, "Fine." So I put that on with my Tommy's uniform, went downtown to Portsmouth to have a drink in the bar, a pub, and they were just jammed. It was full of people celebrating. The streets were full. So I said, "To heck with it, I'll go home and go to bed and have a good night's sleep." First bed I've been in for 5 years. So
we got to Paris, and then I got stamped and deloused and all that sort of stuff, and I was under control. So. See, before I was just wandering around doing what I wanted to do, but after we got to Paris, and then I was sent to we had repatriation camps for prisoners of war. They were called Lucky Strike, Chesterfield, all named after cigarette brands, and I went to Camp Lucky Strike, and waiting for to go back home. And I bumped into a buddy of mine that was shot down about 3 months earlier than me. So we decided to go AWOL and hop a ride back to England, get back to the unit, thinking we'd be able to stay.
The next day they sent it by transport to Brussels. There we interrogated again and put it into a hotel. And I got a new uniform, khaki army battle dress. And that was the VE night. And they gave us so much francs, and we went into town, and then went to the pictures, saw arsenic and old lace, and when we came out, everybody was shouting for joy. It was VE night. And we joined the celebrations.
They deloused us. That's how we were received.
They just grabbed us, deloused us, gave us fresh uniform, fed us, gave us our dog tags back again. Got us to the nearest airport on a Lank, piled us in, standing up even, with no seats. We were just into a Lank, landed in the Midlands. One night there was a hospital there, they checked us out, and then home. 10 days I was home in my own home. Yeah, wonderful, fantastic.
So we hopped a ride on a B-17 and got back to England, made it up to Kingscliff. Big hello with everybody, and telling our war stories and this sort of stuff. And after about 3 days, they were told, "You got to go back. You can't stay because you're labeled as a POW, and you have to go through the bureaucratic processing of a POW." So we went back to Lucky Strike, and I was on the last convoy. I got back to the States on the 1st of June, and got married on the 13th of June to my fiancée Josephine, who my aircraft was named after. And
I had to get my mother's permission to get married because I hadn't turned 21 yet.
The former prisoners were, of course, glad to be home, but they would need a period of adjustment to peace.
Everyone was so glad to see me, you know, it was just fantastic. And we had a big welcome in Halifax. They took us down to the mayor's hall and made a big feast there, and we were welcomed home by the mayor and all the rest of it. They made a big fuss of us, yeah. Yes, it was a good time. But I was glad to be on my own for a bit quiet, yeah, after prison camp.
Hard to really judge. I think I found concentrating difficult, and I found my memory was poor too for some time.
See, I'd had no responsibility for anything for 4.5 years. I was taken prisoner when I was exactly 20 years of age, and I was now damn near 25. And I was still 20 years old, because I had no experience of the world. So yes, I did have some trouble adjusting.
VE Day meant different things to different people. For some, especially for those in the armed services, it was the relief that they had survived. For others, it meant the resumption of the normality of daily life without the fear of being attacked.
We were glad it was over for all sorts of reasons, and relieved, I suppose, to be there. I mean, I had served right through from day one, and so I was lucky, very, very lucky.
Army had set up a sort of field kitchen, and I had the most memorable meal of my life: white bread and jam and a cup of tea, sweet tea, and after 3 years of black German bread, that was memorable.
All we did think of was food, of course. I can remember once they took us to a canteen where they were feeding us, and there was a long line, of course, marching up, and that line never stopped. It went on and on till all the food was gone. In the end, they had to say, "I'm sorry, there's just no more. You've eaten everything we've got." They just kept, if you finished, you went round again, you see. You went round and round, and you were lucky if you got 2 helpings, but I always remember that. We just ate everything in sight.
I spent 3/4 of an hour standing under a hot shower. hadn't had a bath in God knows when. And then had to sleep. Then we were given travel warrants and so on and so forth, and clothes. Did we given clothes? Yeah, I think it must have been given a battle dress, I think. Can't remember. Battle dress and a kit bag, that's right. And given a travel warrant to go home.
I remember looking forward to bananas coming. I had never eaten a banana until I was 6 or 7 years old, and my mother came home triumphantly with this thing, unpeeled it for me, and I thought it was dreadful. I'd been really looking forward to it for years, you know, a banana, you know, from the Caribbean, and there was this thing without any taste whatsoever.
For the crowds happily celebrating the victory in Europe, there was a cloud on the horizon. There were many for whom the Second World War was far from over. In the Far East, the war raged against Japan. Even as the parties in London and Paris continued into the night, US forces were locked in a deadly battle for the island of Okinawa. It was to be one of the major battles of the Allies' Pacific campaign, because if the Americans succeeded in capturing it, they would have access to airfields, which were just over 300 miles from the Japanese home islands. For 82 days the battle raged as the Japanese defenders mounted a desperate resistance. Finally, on June the 22nd, the Japanese surrendered what little there was left. It seemed that the battle to defeat Japan was only going to be achieved by a monstrous cost in human lives. Britain and her allies were also fighting equally bitter battles in Burma. It looked like more forces were going to be needed to defeat the Japanese army. In the end, they were not needed. On August the 6th, a lone US bomber dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. 2 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. At the same time, the Russians invaded Manchuria. Japan's resources were exhausted and its will to fight crushed. On September the 2nd, Japan signed an unconditional surrender. The Second World War was over. Although the victory over Japan was celebrated, the event was, for many, a more personal experience than the wild fervour of VE Day.
I was wounded, of course. I don't really, but that was on the first day of peace. What happened was I was tour expired on the 29th of June, but getting out of Burma was difficult. So I was waiting for transport with my navigator, and we were on the squadron for another 2 months waiting for a transport. So by this time the squadron moved from Kinmagon to Morbi, which was at Rangoon, just north of Rangoon. And when we got there, I wasn't doing anything, I wasn't flying anything, but the war ended with the atom bomb thing, and of course the big celebration in the mess. And the non-drinkers, no, I didn't drink, you see. There were 5 of us who didn't drink. When they start singing songs it's boring. So we went back to our tents. And each of us had a bomb thrown in the tent. What happened was there was a raiding party of Japanese in the jungle. They didn't know the war was over. They attacked the airfield. They had a damaged aircraft, and we had no defences. They withdrew all arms on the first day because of the celebrations after the First World War caused so many accidents that they withdrew all arms. So we were undefended.
Meanwhile, in Europe, there was the formidable task of building a lasting peace. The last days of the war had created millions of refugees, as those that could left their bombed-out cities. The straggling groups of civilians, burdened down by what they could carry, joined German soldiers on the roads heading west, desperate to escape the advancing Russian armies. Thousands of German prisoners of war were held in pens to be processed before they could be released. It had already been decided by the Allies that those responsible for some of the most appalling crimes in human history would be put on trial for their crimes. Not surprisingly, many tried to slip through in disguise. Children played amongst the ruins. Many had been badly traumatized by what they had seen. As so many able-bodied men were gone, it was left to the women and the old men to begin the grim task of rebuilding stone by stone. Although the Russians had captured Berlin, it was agreed that it would be divided into 4 zones, each under the control of the Americans, British, French and Russians. Montgomery and the 7th Armoured Division was tasked with overseeing the reconstruction of the British sector. When they arrived at the beginning of July, even the battle-hardened veterans of the famous Desert Rats were shocked by what they found. The stench of death was everywhere. Below the rubble lay rotting corpses. The civilians had been reluctant to disturb anything in case they released disease. Building the peace was not going to be easy. In Britain, there was the challenge of not only rebuilding the physical damage of war, but also how to demobilise millions of service men and women. With over 5 million in uniform, a release programme was devised that gave priority to age and the number of months served.
But then I've going to be some problems for me when I get out of here, you know.
I'll say.
That's my job. I've grown out of the one I was in. Besides, I want a better one. Now I've got a wife and kid to keep.
Well, there's an answer.
Well, supposing I start up on my own, a small shop or something like that, how would I go about it?
There's a...
And the wife, she must be full of problems. What with trying to find a new house and making a claim for the old one that was blitzed and getting furniture.
Well, there's an...
And honestly, pal, I still don't know what I get for my bit in this war.
Well, listen. In Civvy Street now...
Blimey, that's quick, isn't it?
There's the Resettlement Advice Service in all areas. There's one in your district. This is what it looks like. It's run by the Ministry of Labour. This is what it's like inside. You can discuss your problems in private.
In the search for a lasting peace, delegates representing 50 countries had been meeting in San Francisco for the first United Nations Conference on International Organization. Their objective was to find a mechanism that could prevent wars like the one the world was just emerging from.
In the last 6 terrible years, unnumbered men have died to give humanity another chance. Unnumbered men have died because they felt there was a job of work to be done. We too have a job of work to do if we are not to fail these men. Let us do it with courage, modesty, and dispatch. Let us do it now.
They agreed to a new UN Charter, marking the birth of the United Nations. On June the 24th, 2 days before the United Nations Conference ended, the Russians mounted the longest and largest military parade ever held in Moscow's Red Square. Over 40,000 Red Army soldiers and 1,850 military vehicles joined the parade that lasted over 2 hours. The big three wartime allies of Russia, Britain and the United States met just one more time in Potsdam in July the 17th, 1945. Their objective was to reach an agreement as to how a post-war Germany might look. But the old chemistry that had seen them through previous conferences and disagreements was no longer there. Although they agreed to continue fighting as allies in the war against Japan, the lack of a common enemy in Europe meant that there was little consensus as to how to deal with Germany. It seemed as if the old mistakes of the Treaty of Versailles that marked the end of the First World War had been forgotten. They did agree, however, to redraw Germany's borders and divide the country up into 4 zones of control under the Russians, Americans, British and the French. Industrial capability was also limited, as it was hoped that the country could rebuild its economy on a more ruralised and crafts model, a plan that was soon abandoned.
By the summer of 1945, much had changed in Europe. Roosevelt had died in office, Churchill had been swept from power in the general election, Stalin was left to rule the roost. The old wartime alliances were starting to crumble and a new world order was taking shape. The Cold War was about to begin.
The split between the Allies led to controversy over Britain's last victory parade in 1946. The decision was taken to mark the end of the war against Germany and Japan with one final parade. All the countries that had fought alongside Britain were to be represented and duly honoured. But the Poles were not invited. The date chosen was June the 8th, 1946, and thousands flocked to watch the parade.
Well, it was just general knowledge that there was going to be this huge parade, and we knew that it was going to be a mass attendance. So I had a friend I worked with at that time, David Patmore, and we decided that we'd stay out all night in order to get a prime position in the Mall to watch the parade, and we did that.
The victory parade perhaps lacked the excitement of the VE Day celebrations. There wasn't the exuberance and spontaneity that had been the hallmark of events the year before.
The parade itself went on and on and on. It seemed hours long, and I don't think we stayed to the end, to be honest. But we went off then to find something to eat.
There had been time to reflect on the cost to Britain, and it was becoming clear that the cost had been very high, with very little to show for it. It would take Britain a long time to recover from victory, almost as long as it would take the Germans to recover from defeat. But over 1 million people had packed the streets of London on May the 8th, 1945. For many, it was just the sheer joy and relief that the war was, at least for them, finally over. There had been the sacrifices, fear and uncertainty, but they had survived. Whatever difficulties lay ahead, they knew that Britain had done the right thing. It alone had held the moral leadership to stand up against the Nazis at a time when everyone else was willing to cave in. Some celebrating may have even found a moment to reflect on what the future might hold. That after 2 world wars, this time really had to be the last time.